2026 is already 3% over. We need to get in here. No time to waste. Welcome back to Container Bytes. Judah, let's kick off today with freight rates, ocean up, air down. What gives?
Yeah, so as you said, ocean rates kept climbing. For Asia, Europe, we've seen rates really climbing throughout Q4, right? Really since the middle of October when rates hit lows for a year in most lanes. Periodic general rate increases almost every 2 weeks were kept pushing rates up incrementally. And that was really on capacity management. Carriers were reducing capacity in order to keep rates moving up even though volumes were down. But now we're having the start of the pre-Lunar New Year demand bump. And so that started a little earlier than usual, as it has the last couple of years, really because of the Red Sea means that shippers need to make sure they have inventories in place so they're not waiting for a long time after Lunar New Year. And because of that, we've seen rates keep climbing. For Asia, Europe, rates were up 9% to start the year, up to a level of $3,000 per 40-foot container. That's up from less than $2,000 back in October. Asia Mediterranean up 20% to $4,800. And that's a 45% climb since mid-December on that lane. And those are quite high levels back to about where they were during the peak season last year. On the Transpacific, rates are also climbing. So on the Transpacific, we had a similar GRI attempts since October when we had those lows, but they kind of, you'd have an increase and then they'd slide back a little bit, maybe not all the way back to those lows, but the success of those increases were less. And there was a GRI in mid-December, and I thought it was possible that rates would slide back, or if Lunar New Year demand has picked up, they'd keep climbing, and that seems to be what we're seeing. So Trans-Pacific rates to start the year increased 22%. They're up to $2,600 per container, which is 30% higher than mid-December. So we're not seeing that backslide. For Asia, Europe, there's very few blank sailings now. Very little capacity is being removed, and then there's some reports of carriers have been adding vessels because of the demand right now. And for air cargo, it's a different story. Peak season was, November, December, and now we're in kind of the lull after peak season, which is typical. China to U.S. rates eased to about $6.18, and that was down from a high of $8 at some points in December. $3.44 to Europe, and on that lane, the peak had only gotten to $4. Rates have been less volatile there. There's a lot of capacity added there. So we're certainly post peak for air and heading toward the Lunar New Year peak for ocean.
It just feels like it really fits in with the theme that we've been seeing over the past 6 months already, which is air is really responding pretty routinely and pretty regularly. We saw the air peak season. Now peak season's done, and ocean is kind of being more impacted by these external drivers like the Suez Canal and carrier blankings and stuff. The big headline from this week was Venezuela, obviously huge from a geopolitical perspective. What is the freight impact from the Venezuela news?
Yeah, so part of the U.S. strike was actually on the container port. There are the two largest container ports in Venezuela. One of them was hit directly in one of the strikes where there's a military base nearby. It's called La Guaira, if I'm pronouncing that right. And it's actually the only port with a dedicated container terminal, meaning we have cranes in place to service containers, even though it serves lower volumes than another nearby one. So there's questions of what that would mean for the market. And basically, the Venezuelan container market is quite a small one. So they have container handling capacity of about 1 million TEU per year, which is not terribly significant. There aren't even direct port calls to Venezuela on some of the long haul, Trans-Pacific or transatlantic lanes. So it's mostly fed by feeders, which makes it a little bit more flexible. There had been some reports of some transshipments, so containers that would be unloaded in Venezuela and then heading on somewhere else. Those have been shifted to other places just because tensions were rising even before the strike over the weekend. But again, because it's not a very large market for container, it doesn't seem like it's going to have much of an impact on the container market. Tankers and bulk is a much bigger part of their exports and to some extent their imports as well.
I think we're increasingly seeing in these geopolitical conflicts that ports end up as being, real targets. Like we've seen this in Iran, we've seen this in Ukraine and Russia. It's just like really everywhere. So super interesting to see the role that ports are playing here. Let's end with the trade war. Always good for a couple of minutes. What's happening on the trade war front?
Yeah, so latest in the trade war seems to be more signs of kind of dialing back tariffs or de-escalation. So back in September, the administration issued an executive order increasing tariffs on lumber and timber products, including a lot of furniture. And so some of those tariffs went into effect last year, but in that executive order, there was a set date of January 1st, 26 for an increase to 50%. And on December 31st, that was called off. So there's still tariffs on furniture, but they are not, excuse me, increasing like they were kind of designed to in that initial executive order. The Department of Commerce was about to implement like a 92% tariff on Italian pasta, which would have been kind of a deal breaker for Italian exporters of pasta to the U.S. And that also has been called off. Again, there are already existing tariffs. So it doesn't mean that those things are entering tariff free. The bigger question is, is this a trend of de-escalation? Because the big wild card in terms of the trade war for this year, right? Otherwise, a lot of the tariffs are set. The kind of the situation with the U.S. and China is set until November 2026. So tariff wise, status quo is kind of set. There are tariffs in place, but it doesn't seem like they're, much subject to change for a while. But the big wild card is the Supreme Court. They're hearing the appeal of lower courts, which struck down the use of EPA, which is really the law that the administration used for all the country specific tariffs, which are the vast majority of them. And so that's the wild card. If they decide to hold up that decision and strike down EPA validity, what's going to happen? So the White House has been saying that they will quickly reinstate tariffs by other laws, by other means. But the kind of the trends we've been seeing have been steps towards de-escalation and reducing tariffs, especially because the White House is facing pressure in terms of cost of living concerns from the population. So that brings up a question, right? If we're canceling these tariffs, if tariffs aren't being increased, what does that mean if tariffs are, struck down by the courts?
Awesome. Well, Judah, thanks for this. Appreciate the update. Looking forward to keeping these going in 2026. And note for everybody listening, a review left on Apple Podcasts, on Spotify, anywhere where you hear your podcast means the world to us. Looking forward to seeing you. Good review. Oh my God, great,
otherwise,
great clarification. Thanks, everybody. Have an awesome 2026. Okay, cool. Thank you, sir.